Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the webinar, Popular Culture, Racism, and Mental Health. My name is Dr. Mona Lisa Quanto. I'm a consultant psychiatrist in crisis team. I'm also a member of the Royal College and a member of the Association of Black Psychiatrists, UK. The awareness of systemic racism and mental health continues to be on the rise, especially in the Black community, and there's been a lot of discussions around this. This has been captured in popular culture, and more so when there have been worldwide events that have also promoted discussion around racism and racial trauma. As part of the Black History Month, the Association of Black Psychiatrists have, in collaboration with the Royal College of Psychiatrists, has put on webinars to be able to promote discourse around this issue. The Royal College of Psychiatrists is committed to fighting against racial inequalities and also promoting equality and inclusion, both for patients, carers, members, and the wider society. The Association of Black Psychiatrists supports the professional development of psychiatrists through education, mentoring, and training. And it also fosters engagement and discussions around difficult topics around race and racial trauma, and is also trying to promote education, especially for the younger generation. We are blessed with a panel of speakers who have a wide breadth of experience, and I would like them to introduce themselves. So over to you, our speakers. If we could switch their cameras on, please. Thank you. If you could explain, say what your role is. The breadth of experience is quite wide in the music industry, academia, and various other aspects. So I will not be able to do it justice. So if we could start with Jay, please.
Hey, hi everyone. I'm Jay Chambers. So I'm a touring ragga hip hop artist. I'm a spoken word poet working with many different people on different campaigns. The most recent one was with the BBC. I'm also a senior lecturer at the British and Irish Modern Music Institute, authoring a hip hop business and culture module over there, and just generally a community activist working alongside Paris on a joint project that we have called Black in Manchester.
Paris, please.
Yeah, hi everyone. My name's Paris Carrmichael Murphy. I'm a PhD student in education. And before I started my PhD, I spent a lot of time working with children and young people right across the 0 to 25 age range. My thesis at the moment is in education, but it's looking at and exploring adolescent boys' mental health and well-being, but in the context of education. So really looking at the context, the systems that their mental health and well-being is situated within. Yeah, that's me. Thank you.
Thank you. Raphael.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Raphael Travis. I'm a licensed clinical social worker. I'm a professor at Texas State University School of Social Work in the United States. I'm the director of the CREATE Research Lab, which seeks to better understand how hip hop can be used as a force in promoting well-being. The author of The Healing Power of Hip Hop. And my real main area is, how can we invest in the lives of adolescents and young adults in ways that we know honors, who they are as individuals, and see them as more than any label or stigma or diagnosis or category like that. I've been a clinical social worker for over 20 years now, and I'm really excited to be here with everyone. Great to see you all.
Thank you very much for your round of introductions. And I just think we should start off with the first question. It's a very, it has a long intro, but there is a reason for that. So I'll start off. Past 18 months has seen a number of events in the UK and worldwide. The COVID pandemic, which had a disproportionate impact on Black and ethnic minority groups, the death of George Floyd, as well as other worldwide events. These have had a significant impact on well-being and mental health across over a cross-section of the society. There's also been remarkable accounts of resilience and humanity shining through, and people coming together for a common purpose. So my question is, how has popular culture helped further the awareness and discourse around Black experiences, well-being, and mental health? And I'm wondering whether we could start off with Paris, please.
Thank you. Yeah, big question. I think I will focus a bit more explicitly on education. That's the context that I've studied in and worked in. And I think, I think there's a lot of resistance in education actually to embracing popular culture. Definitely, at least in the British context, I can speak, from experience as well. However, there is a lot of great work happening around educating in the broadest sense. So not formal education, but sharing knowledge, generating knowledge, informing people. And there's lots of great work that embraces popular culture in that education kind of sense. And I think I'll give a couple of examples of a few that are really working to shed light on Black experiences in the British context. So one that people might know of is from quite a few years ago. So the rapper Akala, he set up the Hip Hop Shakespeare Company. And what that does is it embraces theatre and performance to really draw, to kind of highlight the similarities between contemporary rappers and William Shakespeare. So it's kind of challenging that notion that only certain kind of language production matters, or challenge this kind of notion that contemporary music, contemporary rappers are not talking sense. Another great example that also draws upon lyrics is Hip Hop Psych. One of the co-founders, Dr. Akeem Sule, who is probably watching now and also fist bumping at the screen at this moment in time. Hip Hop Psych they are really interested in pulling apart and drawing on lyrics in hip hop music, and they're using that to engage with the public, to engage with people who are in training, to challenge stigma around mental health. But also as well, I know, for example, Dr. Akeem Sule uses it as a means to connect with people that he works with in his everyday life, in his kind of professional experience. So that's kind of two examples of people bringing popular culture in and using it to kind of celebrate Black experiences, but within their kind of, to challenge public perspectives. But one more really kind of like interesting one is the Roadworks organisation in Britain. They have a series called Drillosophy. So that's a play on UK drill and philosophy. And they've done a couple of video series where they draw on concepts that relate to urban sociology, philosophy, and I've forgotten what else. But they kind of want to use hip hop lyrics and the music to kind of, not like evidence, like we need to evidence, but to show how contemporary rappers use their music to tell stories, to explore concepts, to educate people, to inform people, and to share experiences of what it's like to be Black in Britain. So that's just a few examples of how popular culture is used and embraced in the education broad sense.
Thank you so much. Jay, do you have any take on this?
Yeah, I think I'm going to speak more from an industry perspective, as the popular culture aspect has been covered. But as we've seen more of a open discussion of mental health within UK music, it's led to the industry actually reacting to it. One of the things that was really interesting to see set up was Music Minds Matter. That was in 2017, which is a great charity which enables musicians to ring them up anytime. It's a 24-hour mind line, 7 days a week, where you can ring to talk through any issues that you may have and get support instantly, which is great. Also, which has also been interesting, is that they're also doing work around helping understand the differentiation between mental illness and mental health, which is also quite important. Also, there's been a change industry-wise due to, I guess, the issue of substance abuse, particularly within the hip hop community, particularly obviously within the UK hip hop community. Organizations like the Music Managers Forum have actually updated their code of practice for music managers, which now includes item 7, which is to make reasonable efforts to address any issues around mental health and well-being, including issues such as substance abuse, both for the artists they represent and for themselves, signposting appropriate support, resources, and anything else where necessary, which is brilliant, because before, what we had in the creative industries was a lot of artists who perhaps were disclosing struggles through their music, and obviously being celebrated for their music, but not necessarily getting access to the help that they necessarily need. So I think that we can see that there is a proper shift within the industry to understanding that we have to have a better awareness of well-being, mental health, and mental illness.
Thank you, Jay. Raphael, I don't know whether you could comment.
Yes, and such great information has already been given by Paris and Jay. And I just want to kind of underscore this idea of how the popular culture helps. It helps by it's the mechanisms of how racism takes place. So that awareness and validation that Paris talked about, it's learning and engaging around how these pathways of racism take place. So we know that racism takes place in these institutional ways. So you mentioned George Floyd and you mentioned these things. These are those structural ways. And so the art helps to spotlight what actually happens. It speaks to the past instances of institutional racism, from slave trade all the way up to the criminal justice system. It kind of tells the story, the mechanisms by which these things take place. So the awareness is not just, hey, this is happening, it's how this happens. It speaks to the interpersonal pathways of racism. So what are those day-to-day interactions? How do they take place? So the awareness is helping to educate everyone about these pathways, even down to the internalized racism that is the byproduct of these experiences of bumping into these structures. So if you hear, art from an artist like Dave, when he says, the blacker the berry, the sweeter the juice, a kid dies, the blacker the killer, the sweeter the news. And if he's white, you give him a chance, he's ill and confused. If he's black, he's probably armed. You see them and shoot, right? So it explains what actually happens when bumping up into these institutions and how systemic it is, and it's not just anecdotal. These are the things that research supports, right? So it helps really bring it home. Here in the United States, we had that recent research article that came out, and it talked about how out of the reported police killings between 80 and 2018, half were unreported. Half of them were unreported, and these are deaths at the hands of the police. And which group do you think was highest when they uncovered? Right, that was the black population, right? So popular culture helps to shine a light on these realities, and it moves beyond the abstract, and it helps validate people's experiences, which are often gaslighted. And it's like, oh, you're just, you're overreacting and things like that. So I think it's really helpful in bringing light to those things. And then that mechanism of empowering, inspiring people to act on behalf of themselves, as well as on behalf of others, and trying to change some of these things that we know are inequitable and unjust.
Thank you for, like the examples you guys have, brought out to fore. What I was also thinking, apart from music, also, I wonder whether you guys have any comments about, cinema, like films, or, any other thing in the media, like the news, and, what kind of role do you think that plays, to the average person on the streets about how Black experiences are reported, either in the media, in the news, or in the film? And what do you think, about that in terms of how it can be depicted in people's mental well-being and mental health as well? Just any comments at all? I don't know who wants to go first.
Yeah, I can add. I think, not sure if I got the whole question, but I think one thing to bear in mind, particularly when we think about mental health and well-being, in this case here, we're talking about, relating to Black communities and Black populations, that I think, it's really, really important to be mindful that popular culture, like Raphael said, sheds a light on these experiences, which are, often rooted in injustice. They're not nice or kind experiences. So I think we have to be mindful that often these representations that we see are rooted in an injustice, are often difficult for people to watch, difficult for people to see. And I think, you know, if we just take them on face value and just look at them as something to enjoy, look at them as something to just consume and just to take in, we can forget that there's a message behind them, or that there is a history or a culture or an experience that has produced that. And we can maybe become, you know, a little bit desensitized to it. We see typically, I know definitely in the British context, a lot of the films and the theatre that we're seeing at the moment is kind of, you know, representing stories and legacies of enslavement. But, you know, that there are more to that. The Black experience is more than that, and that there is more to tune into that we don't always see in things like film or on the news.
And I guess what you're alluding to is that that's where representation matters, in terms of who are those behind some of these narratives, and how can we broaden so that the rich tapestry of experiences become quite evident for people to actually see and make a judgment for themselves. Yeah, thank you, Paris, for that. Jay, do you want to comment on that in terms of other forms of media as well?
Yeah, 100%. I think that to further what Paris was saying about the role of the media in general in terms of film and television, like if we even look at Channel 4's recent 4 to the Floor campaign, in which they were able to do a full weekend of all Black programming, which was really great for young people to go and see themselves represented as more than just criminals or thugs or the usual typecasted roles that are given to a lot of actors within the British context, resulting in them leaving to go towards America for better roles. I think that, you know, the immediate question when I saw that, even though I was filled with pride, was why can't we do this more regularly? And why do we not have platforms and particular spaces where this is normalized? You know, if a network can do that for, you know, and this isn't critical of Channel 4 because they're doing amazing work, but if a network can do that for a weekend, why can't we do that throughout the year? And I think that's one part of the issue. Another part of the issue, which kind of refers to a Q&A question I've just saw, is the representation that we have within the music as well. Like we see a lot of media representation about some of the problems. Like we see a lot of media representation talking about sexism within hip hop. Hip hop wasn't the first genre to be misogynistic, and it's certainly not going to be the last. I mean, if you do your research, you see that rock and roll is incredibly sexist. Country is quite problematic. I actually did this in a lecture of mine where we analyzed country music lyrics. Like there's a song by Johnny Cash where he talks about shooting a man just to watch him die in Memphis. Or there's another country music song that one of my students found, which challenges the woman's right over governance, whether she keeps a child or not. So I think, you know, there's an extra level of censorship, but also scrutiny that's applied to hip hop. And that's probably, in my opinion, tied to the culture in which that comes from.
Jay, for raising a valid topic in terms of when experiences become acceptable for consumption, and when there is a critical overlay for experiences that are depicted in the way it has occurred. But thank you for raising the spotlight on that. Raphael, I don't know whether you want to, you know, comment on
yeah, just to keep it brief, I'm really excited about the representation that we see in television and movies now across outlets. I think there's a lot more Black voices being spotlighted, and it's really exciting. Everything that Paris and Jay said about these alternative representations of the Black experience, which are normal, but alternative in terms of reaching the masses. And I think it's a very exciting time to, you know, for the public to be able to consume a wide variety of the Black experience. As a person that really is invested and engaged in the music scene, I actually think a lot of those representations in mainstream hip hop culture are truncated and are very narrow and stereotyped. And it actually helps to offset and buffer some of those mainstream representations in hip hop culture. So, and that's a whole nother story about why that representation is so narrow. But I'm excited about these other media sources and stories about the Black experience.
Yeah, thank you. And I think that nicely leads us on to the second question, which is, what are the pros and the challenges of the depiction of Black experiences in popular culture? So I don't know whether I'll go the other way around. Should we start with Raphael first?
Sure. I think, one of the main points is research is pretty clear that risk is not distributed equally across society. And the things that we call the social determinants of health, but the things in our environment that contribute to well-being, we know that opportunities and risk is not the same. And oftentimes, our Black communities around the world face more inequity and unjust environments, and that leads directly to well-being. And so one of the pros about showcasing the Black experience is that we get to show that, in clear form, is that, there are a lot of things that are unjust. There are a lot of things that are inequitable, and, we can't sit idly by. We have to be able to do something about it. And so I think that's one of the really significant pros. And, and to our latter point, everything that we've been talking about, it's also a chance to dispel the myth that some of those stereotypes and kind of caricatures of the Black experience, that those are myths. And we get to push back against that. And, obviously the risk or the challenge in displaying is this perpetuating of stereotypes and these, and these truncated views of who we are. And the last thing, and this one I think is for me is a concern, and sometimes by showcasing trauma too much and pain, you heard of the term sort of trauma porn, right? This idea of pain, Black pain and suffering and trauma almost becomes entertaining, or a way of people can co-opt that, and it ends up doing more harm than good. And so I think that's a concern as well.
All right, thank you. Paris, I don't know whether you want to comment at this point.
Yeah, I think kind of building on what Raphael said a little, I suppose, it's a bit more of a personal experience, but thinking about how depictions can have more of a negative impact, if we don't process them, if we don't look at where they came from and how they've been produced. I always think back to when I was younger, when I was in school, in secondary school, that I only kind of realized this in more recent years, that I was really scared or afraid of telling my teachers that I listened to hip hop or grime. I felt like I couldn't go to school and tell my teachers that I'd been to a gig the night before. And when I think about why that was, it was because I felt like they would judge me. They would assume that I was affiliated with certain things, that I behaved in a certain way. And, a lot of that, I suppose, was rooted in depictions on TV, and people maybe, it was my perception, but maybe teachers not engaging with it on a deeper level and just seeing something on TV and thinking all people who like that music must behave in a certain way. So I think it's not necessarily that the depiction was the problem. I think it's that people taking the depiction on surface level and saying, okay, that must represent all of one group. I must kind of treat everybody who identifies with this culture in the same way. I think it's those mechanisms, like Raphael was saying, is that, it's not just the culture, it's not just the representation of the culture that can be problematic. It's the institutions that we're already in that influence the way those cultures are perceived, or those cultures are excluded or, marginalized within the existing system that we're already in.
Yeah, thank you. And I think it's just keeping in mind that there's social determinants of mental health, either difficulties with mental well-being or mental health. And in perpetuating those stereotypes, we can actually exacerbate societal behaviors, which is one of the main tools that, like one of the main reasons why, you have people not access help. So, it has, the media, popular culture is a tool to as much as educate, but if the caution and challenge is not applied, it's also a tool that can cause further harm. I think that's what I'm getting from both you, Raphael and Paris. I don't know, Jay, if you wanted to comment on this, please.
Yeah, a lot of the stuff has been said, but I do think that trauma is one of the biggest kind of issues with our depiction, because our experience, our culture, our existence is more than the trauma that we endure. I feel that You know, when you go into schools and you speak with young people, one of the biggest things that they talk about when you ask them about representation is that they're unhappy with how all of our narratives link to trauma. I think that, you know, as a reference to Channel 4 weekend a few moments ago, I think things like that are really important, but doing that more consistently, I think that would be something that would be great for us to see a consistent representation of Black people, but in a multitude of spaces. For example, obviously my career has led me into academia, but growing up, I never thought academia was a space for me. I never thought that, you know, I'd be qualified as a teacher, doing a master's, being able to go and speak and have different people listen to me. And why is that? And it's because when I turned on the TV, there was nobody who looked like me in these particular spaces. And I think it's championing that. It's getting academics such as yourselves and some of the people on this call to share their experiences and realize that, you know, behind each of these academics is a story of a struggle, but the struggle that they overcame will inspire the next generation to do the same. So I think that's one of the keys to overcoming this issue of depiction. It's actually the transparency of people in these different spaces and encouraging stories of overcoming, not just the struggle.
Yeah. Thank you so much. And there's something else that you touched on, which is very important. You know, people, you know, I've noticed the comments in the chat box about trauma porn, and which what Raphael actually alluded to. But like the Black experience is so rich and heterogeneous that it needs to be represented in media. You know, the food, the culture, the ways of being, not the constant stereotypes about trauma, pain, gang violence. There are so much beauty and heterogeneity within the Black culture that it needs to be represented on television or, you know, music, and appreciated. So I think that's what I'm hearing. But thank you so much for your answers. I was thinking that we go to the next question, which is, what do we think are the barriers? You know, like what some of the answers you gave has kind of led up to the next questions, which is, what are the barriers to arts being used as a tool for engagement across all spheres of society? So we're looking at across, you know, class, age, gender, race, you know. So I wanted to start with Jay, please.
Okay, that's fine. Yeah, so some of the barriers, particularly in my field of music, is white privilege and unconscious bias. Those are two of the biggest barriers that artists and creatives come across. There's actually a really excellent piece of research done that was published under the Black Lives in Music report, where they had a look at just the experiences of Black creatives. So they interviewed, you know, Black females, males, you know, regardless of any sort of physical difference that we have in terms of like accessibility and things like that. And it was really interesting to, you know, confirm some of what we already knew in the industry. It revealed things like 73% of industry professionals have experienced direct or indirect racism. It also said that, you know, there was a racial pay gap that's existent throughout the entertainment industry, with white men earning on average over £495 extra per month when compared to their Black counterparts. For white women, it was £459 more than obviously Black women. And also what was interesting was, as a result of the racial pay gap and obviously the impact of COVID, 39% of Black professionals have stated that their mental well-being has declined as well. So I think when we're talking about the music industry as a whole, we think that because we see representation, we see Stormzy, we see Dave, we see the successes of these few successful entertainers, and we think that things are quite equal in there, but it's only when you actually look and scratch beneath the surface, you see that actually there's still a long way to go. So I think unpicking of privilege would allow that. Once we ask, why is, you know, the industry owned by free labels? Why are most of the heads of these labels who control a lot of the music we listen to all white and not connected to the community? You know, those questions answer themselves. I also think the realization of bias is important, because once you realize the way that the industry is set up, it allows you to navigate it in a way in which you can empower people from marginalized communities to take control and help develop their own culture as well within the entertainment sphere.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I can see how that can translate into the patients that we see day to day, because some of these narratives actually play out in people's lives and lead to mental ill health. Raphael, I don't know whether you can comment on this.
Yeah, so I really appreciate Jay's comment to the sort of infrastructure that's in place. And I'll speak a little bit to the helping professions as a kind of umbrella topic. There are lots of challenges in the professional pathways and the pipeline for being able to in a comprehensive way, use art as a tool for engagement. We think about the education classroom and it not being seen as a competency or a skill that is necessary for professionals in that industry. So therefore, it's not cultivated as something that our classrooms, our teaching environments need to promote. Within research, there are very few people that have done or have the history or understanding. So in terms of approval as an area of study, of inquiry, there's very little people in terms of the gatekeepers that are promoting that as an area of study, and to publish, right? The gatekeepers of, professional publication outlets are not as experienced. And so when people do have viable research, it being seen as something to publish. And even when it's published, where is it presented? And so, even opportunities like this are outstanding, right? It's an opportunity to share what we know from an empirical standpoint, why it's valuable in terms of promoting health and well-being. And then just practice expertise. There's not that many people that have expertise in using the arts as, well, there are a lot of people, but are not oftentimes recognized and compensated and appreciated for the skill that they can use. And so these are very real kind of structural impediments to moving the arts forward, and moving it beyond, our anecdotal understanding, and really, connecting what we know from a research standpoint to what we know from an experiential standpoint. That's why I'm really excited about, everyone here on the call. And I kind of call people like triple threats, right? The people that are artists and practitioner and educator, and then those that are researchers, right? That's an enormous skill set and insight, and so organizations like Hip Hop Psych and Noise Solution and Hip Hop Heals, and the many organizations that we know that are doing the work and trying to integrate, what the science knows, and experiential and their creativity, creative brilliance for themselves. It's very important to overcoming some of those barriers, the real barriers that we know exist.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Raphael, for your comments. Paris, I don't know if you can, if you comment on that.
Yeah, I think I would add to what Raphael was talking a bit more detail about, saying, how we are pushing for people, we have to push for people to recognize the value of our art, our culture, and our expression. And I think, zooming out quite a bit, I think, like Raphael said, there's an institution, there's a system there that makes it difficult for us to authentically and meaningfully appreciate arts and culture. And I think a lot of that, if you think of the cultural theorist Stuart Hall, loads of great work, loads of great talks online about, culture, and thinking about, particularly like you said, Mona Lisa, about representation, and that role of representation. Is representation, enough on its own? But I think a lot of it does come down to, when Raphael was saying about the value, and we're pushing for people to see the value that we know that the arts and the music and the culture comes from this historical, deep-seated belief that there is a high culture and a popular culture, that there is a culture that has more social value, that there is a culture that is worth more, there is a culture that is for certain types of people, So I think a lot of it really is zooming out. A lot of the barriers are rooted in who we perceive to make art, what we perceive to be art, and what kind of expressions, whether they're individual or collective, we recognize and celebrate and make space for.
Thank you so much for bringing that, and I think that actually translates beautifully to how we can incorporate that into mental health. There's been some discussions around like looking at the curriculum to make it culturally relevant, because in education, making education and training culturally relevant will translate to culturally appropriate care or interventions that are offered to people who access our service. Because in trying to serve a population, if you can really understand their experiences, it will be difficult to look at how you can co-produce the intervention that will be of benefit to them. So, I hear and I hear what you guys are saying, and I'm trying to translate it into psychiatry. We look at popular culture from well-being into mental health, and what I'm thinking is that as clinicians, we also have to look at the population that we serve, and if we have people who communicate in this particular way in terms of their music or their stuff, how much do we engage? And I guess that's a call for cultural humility. I think that's what, and curiosity to be able to understand the population we serve and how open are we to those experiences. And media and popular culture has a role to play in that. But thank you so much for beautifully.
Just had one more point, if that's okay.
Yes.
So I also think one thing that I forgot to mention earlier was understanding of the intersectionality of Black experience as well. Black men and Black women, we have shared understanding of the experiences that we have through racism, but obviously there are differences in our experience as well. And I think that one barrier that stands in the way of the arts being used as a tool for engagement across all spheres of society is understanding of that intersectionality. There's not going to be a one-size-fits-all solution to this issue. It's actually, as you said, co-producing with the community, going into the community, hearing the experiences, and then prescribing the relevant solution to that.
Yeah. No, thank you so much. And one thing that comes to mind, Raphael was talking about, films and media, and just like a documentary like 13, the ones that we have in the Association of Black Psychiatrists, we have a culture club where films are discussed, and having a documentary sensitively done in capturing history, but producing it in a format that makes sense. Yes, it was geared towards America, but the way the documentary was produced, people could actually resonate with those experiences. And I'm wondering whether when there's cultural sensitivity in producing material, there is a lot of mileage for using it in teaching, considering that we are trying to make contact with the newer generation and of a different generation. And you have to constantly look at the tools that you use for education. And that's where popular media comes in, or popular art and culture comes in. And, it's important that the content is authentic to be able to be used for education. So thank you. So in addition to the structural and systemic barriers, I think it's very important that the content, it achieves its purpose in what it tries to do. Thank you so much. I'm actually going to go sideways and actually look at one of the questions that I've been asked in the question box, which is, one is, do blues, soul, and hip hop form a continuum about discussion of socio-political issues? Or does hip hop offer something qualitatively different on tackling socio-economic and political issues than the aforementioned genres? And we have a lot of expertise in the room, so I couldn't help but drop this question. So I think what they're trying to say is that what are the sections that are represented in hip hop and how best could we define hip hop? I know you guys have touched on it before, but anybody can, if somebody can just comment on that, please. Yes, Jay, please.
I think that hip hop is unique in the sense that it addresses all aspects of the Black experience because it's an inclusive platform. I think that, rhythm and blues, soul, are genres that touched upon this, but in different ways. And I guess they were perhaps influenced by the time as well and the pressures of the time, because even though the music represented this issue and the struggle that there was going through, it wasn't necessarily heard by global voices. Hip hop has transcended being something that started out in the Bronx to being this global popular culture phenomenon. And so I would say that it has a bigger remit of being able to evoke change. This is why we see it being used in so many different facets of life. We see political figures aligning themselves with hip hop talent in both the US and also in the UK. Jeremy Corbyn, when he did his campaign, did the Grind for Corbyn movement. We had in America, even the likes of Donald Trump, who had some pretty questionable policies, which, made the experience of many African Americans difficult. But he then decided to align himself with Lil Wayne. And so we can't ignore the power of hip hop, in my opinion, on this.
Okay. Thank you so much. Raphael?
Yes, I think it definitely is part of a continuum. And I'd say continuum of the blues and soul, but also the arts movements that occurred at the same times of those music. So there's these parallel arts and, and political social movements rather that were going on at the same time. And so I think it's a continuum of both of those, right? So the kind of social movements and the arts movements. But as Jay pointed out, hip hop is unique in the sense that really the values of the culture at that time spoke both to individual and community improvement. So community improvement was alongside, the individual journey of coping and resilience and transcendence. And I think that empowerment, that dual empowerment, speaks to all marginalized groups. That's what, as Jay was talking about, that's what's allowed it to spread around the globe, is that everybody that experiences oppression and inequity and injustice can tap into that universal desire for empowerment and to have a voice and to have agency. And then there's some unique aspects from an artistic standpoint, is the density of the language, right? The ability to capture so much, the volume of experience in such a short space, which is very powerful. You can accomplish a lot in a very small piece of music or art. And then the last piece I'd say is the immediacy of context. Is hip hop speaks to the place, the moment, and the time wherever you are. Even if you're just in a cipher, you're speaking to the context of that little space and everybody in that period of time. So it is very time specific, and it's going to always speak to current events. And that allows another opportunity for validation of experiences, right? People to be able to tap into, and yes, this is what I'm feeling right now, in a universal sense, but then in a context specific sense as well.
Yeah, and thank you so much. And I think it's just what I'm mentioning, that hip hop is an example of one of the music genres that talk about Black experiences, but you have like the jazz, the blues, spirituals, and I still I'm thinking about yesterday looking at the documentary where some Black artists were actually try to fuse music together, try to bring the spiritual and Negro spiritual with rap and kind of mirror the experiences. So sometimes the stereotype that causes a kind of a detachment of society without fully exploring what these various music genre can do in terms of education or mirroring the Black experience and educating people with the lyrics. I think what we're getting to is that it's the lyrics that matter. There might be different sounds to it, but they are trying to narrate about experiences and not necessarily just dark experiences. It talks about faith, belief, good times, what core values, as much as trauma. So people should be open to those various experiences being experienced. So the next question.
Can I just add to that one, Mona Lisa,
Yes.
please?
Yeah.
And I'm just looking at the question again, and I really like that the question is, does hip hop offer something different qualitatively? And I think that Raphael mentioned that perhaps what hip hop does is that it has such a good, it is able to cram so much into there using language. It uses language, in an innovative way that there is so much in there. So of course it does, but I think also I'm speaking a bit from personal experience and from what I know with my community, that hip hop in a sense maybe is slightly different in terms of tackling socio-economic and political issues as they ask, because it is in some sense, is about the action as well. It's a movement, hip is the knowledge, hop is the movement. You get the knowledge, you use it in the lyrics, you share it with people, and then you move with it. It's a culture, you do something with it. And I think, we see hip hop in that sense is like a praxis. It is, you do something with it. And we see that in things like hip hop pedagogy, when we're using it in education as a means to learn and do and grow. So I just wanted to add that I feel like as well, hip hop is a call as well. It is a call to action to do something.
Thank you. I have another question here from the chat box, which I thought we could look at. And it's, thank you for your, first with a comment, thank you for your comment about the wealth and heterogeneity of Black culture. Can I ask how the panel will define Black culture? Not sure if you should have a capital B. What are you guys' comments about? Who wants to go first?
I'll go just to put myself on the spot because it's a on the spot question.
Big question.
You know, I whether there's a definition or not, I'm not 100% sure if everybody would agree. But you know, I was listening to talking to somebody about the song "Black" by Dave, and one of the things that I felt was brilliant about the track was the unapologetic commitment to the Black community. And so that, you know, leads into that, but it's the recognition of the Black diaspora, right? So it's not necessarily, and it says it even in the words, right? It's not just African-American, right? It's not just the UK Black experience. It's not just the, you know, his parents were from Nigeria. It's not just from the African Black experience, but it's the totality of the Black diaspora. And I think that there are some commonalities, some global commonalities across the diaspora that a lot of the art taps into. Obviously, things are going to be context specific, but there are some broader narratives in terms of identity, how people are represented, the kind of marginalization of identity. And so there are a lot of things that go into that diaspora. And so that's what when I hear about Black culture, that's what I speak to, and 100% capitalize the B in regard to that. So that's kind of my piece on it.
I'll add to that. Thanks for going first, Raphael, because that's such a big question. I would definitely have to admit, you know, that I'm really cautious with how I define things as well. And in part of my research, it's really important for me to consider how I define things. And I'm not sure I have a definition at this point in my life of how I would define Black culture. But I do also think, just to throw a bit of a, you know, just to add as well, that I think to some extent, some people would argue that we shouldn't define it. Because you can run into the risk of people then, you know, overusing that definition and saying, okay, well, this is to be authentic, this is Black culture, this is excluded from Black culture. And, you know, I'm not sure how to word it, but I think, you know, there is pros and cons to defining, but I'm not sure this webinar is a space where I could even attempt it at this time.
Yeah. Thank you. I think the reason why I asked was because it was it was a very big question that needed to looking at from different angles. But if I could add to it, I think even if we start with culture is a group of behaviors that identify people all, you know, in a certain community, and it's acknowledging as human beings we are all different. So there we are unique and we have our own experiences, but we come together, you know, as a people to decide the way we, you know, experience life or things that we have in common, but we still have unique differences. And it's being careful that we do not have labels that, you know, as much as we have things that unify us, there are unique differences that actually make us unique in our own way. And whether it should be defined as a capital B, it's a proper noun. So there are no issues about that. That's the way my own take of that. Another question which got a lot of likes, and I wanted, you know, it's been addressed before, but I'm just wondering whether there'll be additional comments. Young adults between the 16 to 30 are the main consumer group who may have become desensitized to derogatory lyrics condoning relationship violence and sexual aggression, and present negative images of women in hip hop, treating them as mere vehicles for sex. How does this help mental health? As lots of research back up that this mirrors the people's attitude towards women.
I'll take this one if that's okay.
Yeah.
Firstly, I would ask that attendee to go and ask a country musician that, or go and ask a rock and roll musician that question, because we can see arguably higher levels of this. There's been studies that have been done. I mean, you can research them yourselves, where they've done comparative analysis of rock music videos to find the representation of women. And I think it was one of the studies I read where it was 57% of rock music videos have females in subservient roles to men. So the question for me when I'm always presented with this is, well, why is this just specifically focused on hip hop? And also we have to understand when we're talking about, the issues around the violence and the attitudes towards women, we're talking about a genre that is still very much in its growth. Rock and roll has been around far longer, country has been around far longer, and there's a higher level of scrutiny that's applied. And I always think that question comes out of almost from a space where it kind of is judging the culture based on stereotypes, because if you have an understanding of hip hop culture, you know that there's a width and breadth of political hip hop, there's feminist empowerment hip hop, there's people like Rhapsody, who has an amazing album called Eve, which every song is named after a phenomenal woman through history who's empowering thousands of Black girls, if not millions, around the world. So that question for me is quite jarring, because it just feels like that person has a negative, one-minded, narrow view of what hip hop culture is.
I think what I get also from that is that, yes, there are some culture, there are some messages that are perpetrated, but I guess there has to be a collective responsibility in terms of music in general. I think that's what I hear you, Jay, saying, that there has to be a collective responsibility to deal with some of the issues that are being portrayed in popular culture as a whole. And there is a feeling that there is more narrative about hip hop compared to others. It doesn't excuse the behavior, but what you're trying to say is that research highlights that the same amount of messages or even comparable messages might be in other genre of music, but 100%. It feels like, stereotype might drive the critical analysis of the behaviors being portrayed in hip hop a bit louder than other ones. It doesn't excuse the behavior, but it doesn't
excuse the behavior, but you can find avenues of hip hop for whatever you want. If you want to go and find misogynistic hip hop, you can go and find that. If you want to find political hip hop, you can go and find that. And this is what the issue is because we're forgetting that hip hop is a culture, and with hip hop and with cultures, there are codes, signifiers that we understand to be that culture. And because hip hop is something that's become commodified, there are people who necessarily outside of the culture who don't understand the codes of what proper hip hop is. Arguably, if you're following the 5 elements of hip hop, where one of them is knowledge, misogynistic hip hop wouldn't necessarily be classified as traditional hip hop, because hip hop was all about community empowerment and driving our people forward. So even that in itself is something to bear in mind within that. But I'm aware I'm taking up a lot of space, and I'd love to pass over to Raf.
So I love this question, because this is actually the reason that I moved from practice to research around hip hop. That was my fundamental reason. So, at the time, my main goal was looking at all the different ways we can invest in young people's lives. It wasn't specific to hip hop, but at the time, looking at the research, it really fell into 2 categories. One was what I call exposure research, and it was like, what are all the bad things that come from engaging hip hop? And hip hop was actually paired with heavy metal at the time. It was heavy metal and rap music were like the demons of the art industry. And people were asking, like, if you listen to more hours of hip hop and heavy metal or watch more videos, what happens? And then there was the other side of the research, was really unpacking the culture. It wasn't necessarily connected to well-being per se, but it was like, hip hop is more than music. It's a culture, and really kind of flushing it out. But no one was really looking at those things together. And that was my question, right? It was an empirical question. Is it possible that engaging hip hop could be simultaneously helpful and potentially harmful, right? Could it be both things at once? And that's what we found. And it's important, because things don't have to be mutually exclusive. And that's where our agency comes in to everything that Jay was talking about, right? So in the same way as we go to the movies, right? You distinguish within an action film, what is entertaining, what you get messages out of, what's just, glorify violence. And people do that same type of calculation in terms of what they engage. What does this, do for me? And I always tell young people that I work with, whatever you consume, whatever media, ask yourself, what can I learn? How can I grow? Right? You apply the filter to what you engage. The idea that young people are desensitized to, misogyny is a question, right? So we say hip hop is in a couple of years will be 50 years old, right? So that's multiple generations. And I'll date myself a little bit. I'm not under 30 years old, but I was around when there was a lot of hip hop content that was extraordinarily misogynistic. One could argue, where does the current model of high risk hip hop come from? It came from that period when hip hop became commodified, and it moved from this broader representation of the art and the culture and the Black experience to a very narrow, truncated view that's been promoted in the mainstream over and over again since the NWA. If you watch Straight Outta Compton, you can see how that packaging came to place in hip hop and what's been replicated over time. So there's a lot to that, but it's very clear that, in working with young people, we have to help them to explore how the art can be empowering, at the same time being very clear and explicit about the ways that it's risky. It's not just with misogyny, it's around substance use, it's around violence, and how those things are glorified, and the negative outcomes of those things are not represented. So it's complex, but we can't just say that it's all misogynistic and they're desensitized to it and it's all in the music. It's a much broader conversation.
Can I add as well, Mona Lisa, that I think just really quickly as well, I think I would just take this as an example to perhaps say, that it's kind of clear from the answers here that at least the three of us don't perceive or don't see the main takeaway of hip hop to be how it is summarized in this question. There is research on, we've got misogyny there is research that the rap lyrics contain phylogeny, the love of women, but we're not talking about that right now. So I think it's just an example, this question here, of how, depending on what lens we're looking through, how we will perceive something. So, I feel like now I'm having to justify the value of hip hop for myself as a woman. And as this person is, of course, entitled to ask this question, I think it at least exemplifies how, depending on what lens we're looking at it through, we might portray it in a different way to others.
Yeah. Thank you so much for your, very loaded answers, to the question. And the reason why I've brought it is that this is the theme of the questions. And I believe that these conversations are here to be had so that we can explore this biases or stereotypes or feelings or observations in a critical way with an overlay of research, not just observation, and being able to distill what we feel is a more rounded, robust response to some of the questions that have been asked here. So thank you so much for that. And one last question before we go. Do you think that the stereotypes of Black community is decreasing in schools and workplaces, or do you think is getting worse compared to previous years?
So do I think the stereotypes of Black community is
Yes.
decreasing in schools and workplaces?
Yes.
I guess it's difficult with these answers because, as I was saying, we have to firstly recognize the intersectionality of Black experience. My experience is completely different from Professor Travis's and from Paris's and from yourselves. So I think, in my personal opinion, in my experience, no, it's not. I think that, as we're working within academia, as we all know, academia is overwhelmingly white, and we're having to work hard to see more people in here. Like, I think it's something like less than 3% of UK professors are people of color, like Black people. So I mean, that in itself answers that question. Stereotyping of the Black community does exist, particularly with me being a Black man who has locks. Like, when I walk into rooms with academics, I've had people try to touch my hair, I've had people ask me ridiculous questions, and a lot of this comes around education, like we've said, and understanding the way that Black culture is used and commodified, and also understanding the way in which that we need to educate ourselves to these things. The stereotyping of the Black community decreasing in schools and workplaces will only happen once the people who are doing the stereotyping do the work around that. It's not a question necessarily that I can answer as a person of color, or that anyone else on this panel can. It's about the people who are stereotyping doing the work ultimately, in my humble opinion.
Anybody else wants to come in?
Just a very brief comment, and it relates to the comment that you made earlier about finding new ways to communicate. You talked about the film 13th. And, you know, what I've learned as I've gotten older, I sometimes get frustrated about having to say the same thing over and over again. But I've realized that that's necessary because the stereotypes continue, and the very narrow view or the limited view of not just the Black experience, but the experience of all marginalized groups, you know, those things persist. And so we have to keep telling the same stories in new and creative ways, as challenging as it can be. And you know, it's like, why do we have to do that? But it is so necessary, as you pointed out, and we have to find ways to connect with new audiences and help people with however they take in and process their information to be able to deliver it in a way that dispels those stereotypes, because there are always new generations of people that are less aware. And so that's what feeds that. And so, yeah.
Thank you. And Paris, would you want to add something, or can I just come in? You can come in later. Okay, thank you. I think I'm just looking at the time, and I'm just going to sum up. But, you know, it has been, you know, what you all have given is really food for thought. A lot of reflections, you know, that we will take away from here. And I wanted to look at it like from a clinical lens as a psychiatrist. What am I going to ask myself from this webinar? I'm Black, but my experiences are different from other people's experiences here in the room. And the intersectionality of other, you know, factors also may make my own experience unique. So I can speak for every Black person. And how can popular culture take care of all these nuanced experiences? Some people are trying, and some sensitivity in, you know, trying to portray this in media is needed to be able to achieve the education that is required. And thank you so much for your honest answers. And I don't know, I wanted to ask around what will be a take-home point from each of you if we have to say one-liner from, I'll start with Jay.
I think for me, the intersectionality, understanding intersectionality allows you to better understand the experience that we have. There's not one size fit all solution to this problem, but it starts with empathy, understanding and recognizing the difference within our community.
Thank you. Raphael?
So I'm thinking about this from the lens of psychiatrists. I started my postgraduate clinical work many moons ago, back in '97, as part of an interdisciplinary team, including psychiatrists, psychiatric nurses, social workers, you know, and the others that kind of filled out our team. And one of the feelings, kind of the overwhelming feeling in those first few years among this team was when working with the youth, that there were somehow problems, they were broken, that they needed to be fixed, you know, just tweak the medication a little bit. And it wasn't a very validating experience for the youth. And that wasn't why I got into the work. I got into the work to help people like myself, honestly, you know, grew up in a low income neighborhood, faced lots of the challenges that poverty brings to families and communities. And I wanted to help kids like myself. That's why I got into the field. And so, you know, my thing is just, you know, see young people, see them for who they are, you know, validate their feelings, their experiences, you know, fight for them inside your office and outside, you know, recognizing how much environments can contribute to the challenges that young people face. See them for the richness of their culture, you know, the resilience of them, their families, their communities, and then, you know, the intersecting cultures that Jay and Paris have been talking about as well. Your perspective and how you see the people that you work with matters immensely. It matters not just for the interpersonal relationship and therapeutic relationship that you're trying to create, but it helps with these broader narratives that people either buy into or they fight against. You model for your coworkers, you model for the team that you're a part of. And so that would be my real takeaway, and support those doing this work.
Thank you so much. And Paris?
Yeah, I think just thinking a bit more specifically for people who are working, in a setting, maybe in a health setting, just to think about building on what, Raf and Jay have said about thinking about just wanting, being willing to see the person, to see everything and who they are. And I think, we need to pay attention to the explicit and implicit messages that we send them when we discourage them from bringing themselves and their culture to a setting or education setting or wherever, when we push it into the home. And I think just really breaking it down, when we discourage people from bringing themselves and representing their culture, we're asking them, to put aside their music, their film, their dance, their family, their language, their home, their, so many things. So I think really just think about how good of a job can we do if we aren't allowing people to bring their full selves to the space.
Thank you so much for such an interesting, and I wish we had more time to, really do this topic justice. I just wanted to end with a quote that came from Raphael, which says, as a clinician, what I take away from this is, when I see a patient next, the question for myself is, what can I learn and how can I grow? As clinicians, if we cannot develop curiosity, cultural curiosity, and humility, how can we provide co-produced care? Thank you so much for listening, and have a good day or good evening.
Thank you, Mona Lisa.
Bye-bye. Thank you to all the speakers. And I also wanted to say thank you to Catherine and Chloe working hard behind the scenes. Thank you so much, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone.